They laughed, not loud, but enough to stain the air. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into that courtroom, quiet, alone, wearing nothing but a black blazer and a small silver pin shaped like Puerto Rico, they didn't see a threat. They saw an opportunity to remind her who holds the gavel. So when the judge fined her, publicly, for what he called political symbolism, the room leaned back, amused, assured, certain she would shrink like so many others had. She didn't. She simply nodded, sat down, and waited. No outrage, no rebuttal, just a pen in her hand and a look in her eyes that said, "You're not ready for what's coming." And when the lead attorney collapsed mid-trial and the plaintiff, an aging veteran wrongfully injured in state custody, turned to her asking for help, AOC didn't hesitate. What followed was a courtroom argument so precise, so blisteringly calm, that it didn't just shift the case, it rewrote how justice felt that day. This is a dramatized story based on public perceptions, cultural truths, and fictional events. But the emotion, the defiance, the resonance, those are real, because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one they tried to silence. The air inside courtroom 3B of Dallas County District Court was thick with the weight of silence, anticipation, and something no one wanted to name out loud: tension. It was day 4 of the Monroe v. Ashland correctional hearing, and even without national cameras, even without any breaking news banner running across the bottom of a screen, every seat was taken. Law students lined the back wall, some cross-legged on the floor, scribbling furiously into ruled notebooks. A retired couple, who'd shown up every morning since the start of the trial, sat stiffly near the center aisle, the woman clutching her tote as if it were armor. Near the front, reporters from 3 local papers kept phones on silent and fingers twitching above send buttons. Everyone was waiting for something, though they didn't know what. At the plaintiff's table, Lauren Gates, barely 32, tightened her grip around a mechanical pencil. Her notes were marked in blue ink, underlined in 3 colors, and smudged at the edges. The AC vent above her head whined slightly, but she didn't look up. She'd gone over her argument 6 times that morning, but her stomach still felt like it was filled with broken glass. She was good. Everyone said that. But good didn't always matter in a courtroom like this, especially not under Judge Driscoll. And then, just as she reached for the affidavit folder, the door at the back creaked open. Not slammed, not swung, just a slow, quiet creak. The kind that doesn't just enter a room, but announces itself without saying a word. Heads turned. A woman walked in, alone. No assistants, no rolling briefcase, no entourage. Just a simple black blazer, dark jeans, a leather-bound notebook hugged to her side, and a small silver pin, barely larger than a coin, shaped unmistakably like the outline of Puerto Rico. A few people whispered, "Was that? No. Wait, was that really her?" Even Lauren blinked. The sudden movement in her peripheral vision jolted her enough to momentarily forget her notes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in person, no announcement, no press. But why was she here? She didn't make a sound as she moved down the center aisle. No smiles, no nods. Just a kind of focused stillness that made people move without knowing why. She slid into a front row seat, just behind the plaintiff, behind the man whose ribs had been broken in state custody. She didn't pull out a phone. She didn't even glance around the room. She just opened her notebook, worn leather, corners soft with age, and began to draw something. Not write, draw, lines, arrows, loops, legal shorthand in clean, exact strokes. Like someone diagramming a system she already knew how to dismantle. But that wasn't the part that caught people. It was the pin. Not flashy, no sparkle, no name, just a quiet shape. Silver, deliberate. It caught the courtroom lights exactly once. A glint of something personal in a place that demands people strip the personal away. Judge Driscoll hadn't entered yet, but the courtroom had already changed. Lauren could feel it in the way the older juror in seat 6 shifted. In the way Sturgis, the defense, stopped whispering to his paralegal, and just watched. AOC didn't seem to care. She wasn't there to be seen. But now that she was there, no one could look away. Why her? Why now? Was she involved? Observing? Waiting? Was there something about this case, this plaintiff, that mattered enough to draw her here without announcement or fanfare? No one knew, and the not knowing was suddenly louder than anything anyone had said since the hearing began. And then the bailiff spoke. "All rise." The courtroom door clicked shut behind her, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't react. She remained seated in the front row, her notebook open, pen in hand, eyes steady on the plaintiff's table. Her posture wasn't rigid, but composed, like someone used to being watched, and even more used to not being welcomed. The silver Puerto Rico pin caught the light again as she turned a page. Subtle, unobtrusive, and yet unmistakably personal. Moments later, the chamber door at the front of the courtroom opened, and Judge Raymond Driscoll entered with a heavy stride. Late 50s, angular face, graying at the temples. His black robe, just slightly frayed at the hem, skimmed the floor as he climbed the 3 steps to the bench. He didn't make eye contact with anyone as he settled into his chair, adjusting a pair of reading glasses on the bridge of his nose. "Be seated," he said without lifting his gaze. Papers rustled, feet shuffled, and the murmurs that had hovered faintly over the room like background static finally fell quiet. For a moment, there was only the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic tap of Lauren Gates flipping through her notes with meticulous urgency. Then, just as Driscoll reached for the first folder, a pause. His eyes shifted. Something in his peripheral vision had registered. He leaned slightly forward and tilted his head, not dramatically, not aggressively, but with that kind of judicial scrutiny that suggested he had already formed an opinion before he knew what he was looking at. He squinted, then tapped his pen softly against the folder. "Madam," he said, voice loud enough to carry across the room. A few people turned, unsure who he meant. "You in the front row, black blazer," he clarified, eyes now fixed directly on AOC. "Would you mind standing for a moment?" She stood without hesitation, calm and direct. "Yes, Your Honor." Driscoll gestured vaguely toward her lapel. "That pin, the silver one." She didn't look down. "Yes?" He folded his hands. "We don't permit political symbols in direct view of the jury. Courtroom protocol is clear on that." There was a beat of silence, not confusion, just disbelief. AOC's voice was measured and even. "It's not political, it's personal." "Perhaps," Driscoll replied, "but perception matters. We ask observers to refrain from wearing items that might be interpreted as partisan or provocative." Her eyes didn't waver. "It's a keepsake from my grandmother. She wore it the day she was denied a loan for speaking Spanish in the bank. I wear it as a reminder, not a message." A flicker of something moved across Driscoll's expression. Frustration? Embarrassment? It didn't last long. "Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, you are welcome to remain," he said, the syllables crisp now, clipped with authority. "But unless you remove the pin, you may not sit in the gallery directly behind the plaintiff. I will also issue a fine for non-compliance with courtroom decorum." "I respectfully decline," AOC said simply, "and I'll pay the fine." A hush rolled across the gallery. Not shock exactly, but the sharp collective inhale of a room, realizing they'd witnessed something they weren't expecting. One reporter blinked twice and immediately began tapping into their phone. A student in the back reached for a second page of notes. Lauren Gates froze mid-highlight, eyes locked on the exchange without turning her head. Driscoll tapped his gavel once. $200. Bailiff, please make a note." AOC nodded once and sat down. No protest. No glance around the room to see who was watching. Just a calm return to her notebook. The scratch of her pen on the page resumed, smooth, steady, unaffected. She didn't move. She didn't shift in her seat. But the courtroom had changed again, subtly but unmistakably. Not because someone had spoken too loud, but because someone had spoken just enough. From the bench, Driscoll looked down again at his folder, but he didn't open it. He just stared at the page, like the words had gone missing. Lauren Gates didn't turn her head, but she could feel the weight of the room tilting, subtly but definitely, toward the front row. She'd heard the exchange, every word of it, the judge's clipped tone, the barely veiled warning, the imposition of authority disguised as neutrality, and then AOC's voice, quiet but calibrated like a tuning fork, the kind of tone that didn't need to rise to be heard. Lauren didn't look back, but she shifted just slightly in her seat, allowing her peripheral vision to catch a glimpse of the woman behind her. AOC hadn't moved. She was seated exactly as before, notebook open, pen in hand, her posture unbothered. There was no triumph on her face, no hint of smugness. Just control, cool, unflinching, measured, like someone who had been through versions of this moment 100 times and no longer felt the need to respond emotionally. Their eyes met for only a second. No nod, no smile, just acknowledgement. The kind of quiet, instinctive communication shared only by women who've had to defend their right to exist in certain rooms. Cecil Monroe, seated next to Lauren at the plaintiff's table, leaned slightly in her direction and whispered through the corner of his mouth, "That's her, isn't it?" Lauren kept her eyes on the judge but replied softly, "Yeah, that's her." Cecil exhaled like he had just recognized someone from a photograph he didn't know he'd memorized. "Didn't expect her here," he added. "Me neither," Lauren murmured, and she meant it. It wasn't that AOC didn't care about justice. Everyone in the room knew she did. But this case, this quiet civil rights suit buried under procedural motions and untelevised hearings, didn't scream political moment. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't national, it wasn't the kind of battle most people traveled for, unless they already knew there was something beneath the surface. The courtroom began to settle again. Judge Driscoll moved on without another mention of the pin or the fine, as though the moment had closed. But it hadn't. Not really. It hung there, unspoken, like a wire stretched taut between decorum and defiance. People shifted in their seats, not restlessly, but attentively. The same reporters who'd looked half bored 20 minutes ago now had their phones hovering just a little closer to their laps. One juror, an older woman in seat number 9, glanced toward the front row more than once, and AOC, for her part, began to write again. Not frantic scribbles, not the random doodles of someone passing time. She drew arrows, marked lines, circled timestamps in margins. Legal shorthand appeared on the page with practiced speed, and while no one could see exactly what she was constructing, it was clear that she wasn't just observing, she was analyzing, preparing. The ripple had started, software silent, but real. The woman who wasn't supposed to be part of this story had just become the one no one in the courtroom could stop watching, and though she hadn't said another word, the room was already listening to her. The courtroom resumed its rhythm with the same clinical formality it had started with. Motions, acknowledgments, call to witness. But for Lauren Gates, the beat of it all felt just slightly off. She rose slowly from her chair, adjusting her blazer once with deliberate precision. Her hands looked steady, but her palms were already damp. She cleared her throat and faced the jury, offering the kind of nod that straddled confidence and forced calm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this is not a case about disagreement. It is not a case about uncertainty. This is a case about accountability." Her voice carried, not loud but resonant, crisp with the kind of edge only earned from months of meticulous prep work and personal conviction. Behind her, Cecil Monroe sat upright, his suit slightly too big at the shoulders, his eyes locked on a spot just above the jury box. He didn't blink much, didn't fidget, but every line in his face looked like it had been carved by disappointment. Years of it. Lauren walked them through the timeline. She pointed to the clerical error that landed Monroe in Denton County's Ashland Correctional Facility. A mistake in a system that processed thousands of names a week. He should have never been there, period. Then came the injuries, fractured ribs, nerve damage, a limp he never had before. 2 weeks, she said firmly. That's all he spent inside. And it changed everything about the way he walks, the way he sleeps, and the way he trusts. She referenced intake forms, medical reports, witness affidavits. She avoided flourish. She knew better than to overplay emotion in front of Driscoll. He hated anything that smelled like theater. Her strategy was simple. Line up the facts, brick by brick, until no one could deny what had been built. But facts, she was beginning to realize, could only hold the wall for so long. Because then Daniel Sturgis stood, mid-40s, polished and pale, with the kind of voice that had been trained at a private law school, not in courtrooms but in lecture halls and deposition lounges. He didn't walk to the jury, he strolled. His jacket didn't wrinkle, and his smirk wasn't quite a smirk, but something more insidious. Condescension disguised as charm. "Thank you, Ms. Gates," he said with a slight bow of the head before turning to the jury. "Now let's talk about memory, about the difference between pain and perception." He opened by suggesting Monroe's injuries could have predated his incarceration. A bar fight in 1989 was mentioned. Irrelevant, but allowed. Then he questioned whether a man Monroe's age could reliably recount a timeline under stress. He implied that the witness, a fellow inmate, had incentive to fabricate. None of it was new, but all of it chipped away at the case, one blow at a time. Lauren objected, and occasionally the judge sustained. But the rhythm was shifting. The jury didn't lean in the same way. A few glanced at Monroe differently now. The idea had been planted. Behind the plaintiff's table, AOC remained still. Her eyes tracked every movement, every slide shown, every name uttered. Her pen didn't stop moving. While others looked puzzled, she was drawing. Not doodles, diagrams, flowcharts, timelines, systems. She wrote like someone not reacting to the moment, but mapping the next one. Lauren sat down slowly as Sturgis returned to his seat, satisfied. Her breathing was still steady, but her eyes were sharp with fatigue. She could feel the edge slipping. The courtroom hadn't turned on her. Not yet, but it had tilted. And she was starting to wonder if all the truth in the world was enough when the rules seemed written to bend around it. The cross-examination began with a smirk and a paper shuffle. Daniel Sturgis rose again, already loosening his cuffs as if preparing for a leisurely walk through an argument he believed he had already won. He approached the stand with that rehearsed cadence, calm, smooth, almost conversational. His tone was friendly, but his words carried barbs sharpened by years of dismantling plaintiffs before they even knew it had begun. "Mr. Monroe," he started, "you testified that you sustained injuries during your brief stay at Ashland Correctional. Would you agree that these injuries were not documented until after your release?" Monroe squinted slightly, confused by the framing. "I saw the nurse after I got out," he said slowly. "They didn't check me in there, just told me to stop complaining." Sturgis nodded with mock sympathy, then turned to the jury. "No documentation while in custody, only after." He paused as if allowing the implication to ferment. Then he pivoted. "Let's talk briefly about a separate incident. You were involved in a bar altercation back in 1989. Do you recall that?" Lauren stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant." Driscoll barely looked up. "Overruled. Proceed." The words landed like a slap. Lauren sat down too quickly, her knees knocking lightly against the table's edge. She steadied her breath, reached for her pen, then realized her hand was already trembling. Sturgis continued without missing a beat. "In that police report, you were described as combative and under the influence. Could your injuries possibly relate to an old trauma resurfacing?" Monroe's face tightened. "That was decades ago. I didn't walk with a limp back then." Sturgis raised his eyebrows. "But it's hard to prove that, isn't it?" Lauren opened her mouth, ready to object again, but Driscoll raised his hand slightly. "Mr. Sturgis," he said, voice lower now, "move on." The defense attorney nodded, barely containing the smug satisfaction on his face. He walked back to the table with theatrical patience, flicking through his folder as if everything was unfolding precisely on schedule. His strategy wasn't to beat the truth. It was to bury it beneath distractions, insinuations, noise. Lauren tried to keep her focus sharp. She scanned her notes, underlined something, then reached for her water but hesitated. Her vision was beginning to blur at the edges. She blinked hard, trying to refocus. The temperature in the courtroom felt like it had risen 10 degrees. Her ears started ringing faintly. She pressed her fingertips into the table, just enough pressure to stay grounded. Then came the final question, a loaded inquiry about the witness, Jerome King, an inmate who had submitted a sworn statement on Monroe's behalf. "Jerome King," Sturgis said, "was convicted of perjury, wasn't he?" Are we to believe a man who's lied under oath is suddenly trustworthy now? Lauren stood up abruptly. Objection! Badgering the witness? Her voice cracked. She swayed. One hand reached for the edge of the table, but her grip missed. Her folder slipped. Papers scattered. She took one step back, then collapsed. It happened in a single, disorienting moment. Her knees buckled inward. Her shoulder struck the corner of the plaintiff's table on the way down. A thud. A gasp. Someone in the gallery shouted, "Call 911!" The bailiff rushed forward, knocking over his own chair. A woman from the back row, possibly a nurse, moved through the benches in seconds and dropped to her knees beside Lauren. She was breathing, but shallow, and her skin had gone pale. And AOC, already standing before anyone else had moved, was there too. She moved through the aisle without pushing, without panic, but with absolute clarity. Her hand guided Monroe gently aside as she knelt down beside Lauren, helping the others turn her on her side. Her voice was low but direct. Keep her head tilted. Keep the airway clear. Nobody asked how she knew what to do. Nobody even questioned why she was the one giving directions. In that moment, no one cared who had been invited. They only cared that she was already where she needed to be. The double doors at the rear of the courtroom banged open as the EMTs pushed through with swift, trained efficiency. Lauren lay motionless on the stretcher, oxygen mask already over her face, her skin still unnervingly pale. One of the paramedics asked quick, clipped questions, pulse, known conditions, current medications, while another lifted her wrist to check for a second reading. The murmurs in the gallery had turned into a concerned hush, a shared breath held collectively as the gurney rolled forward past the plaintiff's table and toward the exit. Cecil Monroe stood frozen, hands slightly raised as if asking permission just to look. The wheels of the stretcher squeaked as it passed. When Lauren disappeared through the courtroom doors, something in the room collapsed with her, like the scaffolding of a fragile case had lost its central beam. Judge Driscoll cleared his throat, already tapping at his desk with that familiar impatience. This court will recess until further notice. Counsel for the plaintiff is indisposed. Will reconvene once representation is reestablished. But Cecil didn't sit. He turned slowly at first, then fully, locking eyes with AOC. She's gone, he said. Not a question, a statement. His voice was strained, not loud, but it carried. And I've got no one else. AOC's pen was still in her hand. She hadn't written anything since Lauren fell, but she hadn't looked away either. She regarded him with the same quiet steadiness that had anchored her since she first entered the room. You've been sitting there the whole time, Cecil continued, louder now. Writing, watching. You know this case better than anyone else in here right now. You know it. A low rustle moved through the gallery again. The judge sat straighter, sensing something building. Miss Ocasio-Cortez, Driscoll said slowly, clearly hoping to redirect the moment. You are not counsel of record. If Mr. Monroe wishes to seek new representation, he may do so, outside this courtroom. Cecil didn't back down. She's a lawyer, right? That's what I heard. AOC, before she ever went to Congress. That's true, ain't it? AOC remained seated, pen still in her hand. I'm admitted in New York, she said. Her voice was soft but firm. And I hold a limited practice certificate under Rule 15E, which allows me to appear in Texas courts under provisional status, if granted permission. Driscoll's eyes narrowed slightly. You came prepared? I came to observe, she replied, but I don't believe in showing up unprepared, especially where power is concerned. He exhaled through his nose, clearly weighing the optics. If you intend to act as counsel, this court needs confirmation and declaration on record. I will allow 10 minutes to review the file and make your position clear. Another ripple passed through the crowd, reporters pulling out notepads, phones quietly buzzing in gallery pockets. Even the jurors, still seated due to the unexpected recess, leaned in slightly, as if sensing history inching closer by the second. AOC finally stood. She didn't rush. She didn't look around for permission or approval. She simply stepped toward the plaintiff's table, reached for the manila folder Lauren had left behind, and opened it. The shift was immediate. Not in the volume of the room. It remained quiet, but in tone, in posture, in possibility. Where chaos had cracked the surface just minutes ago, a new current of focus surged forward. She flipped through the documents with a surgeon's precision, circling 3 key pages, adding a single post-it note on a summary chart, highlighting timestamps like she'd seen the footage already in her mind. Cecil watched her the entire time, mouth slightly parted, a question in his throat that he no longer needed to ask. And when she looked up again, not to him, but to the bench, Judge Driscoll straightened unconsciously. AOC didn't smile. She didn't nod. But in that moment, it was clear. She hadn't come to take over the room. The room had simply realized it needed her. The manila folder Lauren had left behind wasn't thick, but it felt heavier than it looked. AOC sat at the plaintiff's table now, the first time since entering the courtroom that she'd crossed the line from observer to participant. She didn't pause to acknowledge the eyes on her, though she felt them, thick as humidity. Instead, she opened the file with the practiced motion of someone who had flipped through evidence packets in late-night silence more times than she could count. The first sheet was a copy of Cecil Monroe's intake form, his name in block print, inmate number beneath it, and the initial date of incarceration, January 2nd. There, near the bottom in faint red ink, hold lifted, January 11th. AOC noted the date with a quick circle, her pen moving almost faster than her glance. She flipped to the next page, a discharge form dated January 13th, 2 days after the release should have occurred. Already the timeline was splintering. She scanned through the next few entries. Photographs of bruised ribs, medical notes documenting radial nerve damage in the left forearm, a nurse's statement saying Monroe complained of pain but presented no visual trauma at time of release. That line made her pause, not because it was damning, but because of the implications beneath it. Pain, but no trauma. A phrase that too often became the justification for ignoring suffering altogether. AOC flipped to the next document. The incident report from the facility, except the names of the officers had been redacted, and the timestamp was printed in a different font, like it had been added later. She made another circle, underlining the words limited visibility from the shift log. The pattern was forming. She wasn't building a case from scratch. She was decoding the deliberate obfuscation of one. Across the aisle, Daniel Sturgis leaned back in his chair and watched. He hadn't said anything yet, but his posture screamed confidence laced with disdain. His fingers drummed lightly against his folder in a rhythm that seemed both bored and self-satisfied. When AOC paused to glance briefly at a diagram Lauren had drawn in the margins of a printout, Sturgis finally spoke. Well, he said, just loud enough for the room to hear, but pretending to direct it toward no one in particular. The Congresswoman thinks she's a lawyer today. A few quiet chuckles surfaced from the gallery, the kind that fizzle out before they gain traction. AOC didn't look up. She turned a page, scribbled something, drew an arrow between 2 seemingly unrelated timestamps. Her pen moved steadily as if his voice hadn't registered at all. Sturgis shifted slightly, annoyed by the lack of reaction. I mean, really, I've seen courtroom theater before, but this is new. She's turning federal office into a side gig. Still, she didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes were fixed on a page that showed overlapping security logs, the guard rotation schedule layered against the keycard swipe records. She drew a thin line between a 5:12 a.m. swipe and a 6 a.m. entry, recorded in the handwritten logbook. Cecil, sitting quietly beside her, leaned closer. That means something. She nodded once. It means they were there an hour before they were supposed to be. Cecil looked confused. That's bad. It's unusual, she said, underlining the time again. And unusual matters when they say nothing unusual happened. She reached for the last document, a witness affidavit from Jerome King. It was surprisingly detailed. Dates, sounds, exact positioning in the unit. Most of all, it included an observation. 3 guards entered Monroe's cell. One stood by the door, didn't speak, just watched. AOC tapped the edge of the page, thinking, calculating. Across the aisle, Sturgis shifted again. This time, he stopped smirking. Because whatever she was building, it wasn't for show. It was for execution. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood, the courtroom didn't make a sound. Not because they were waiting for theatrics. No one really expected those from her, but because something had already shifted in the atmosphere. This wasn't the same woman who had sat quietly in the gallery 3 hours ago, fined and dismissed for a pin no larger than a thumbprint. This was someone the room had underestimated, now standing at the center, calm, composed, and holding the floor like it had always belonged to her. She didn't approach the jury box right away. Instead, she opened the file again, gave one final glance to the page she had marked earlier, and stepped just far enough from the plaintiff's table to be seen clearly by all 12 jurors. And, more importantly, by Judge Driscoll. "My name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez," she began, her voice steady but not cold. "And while many of you may know me from other rooms, this is not about that. Today I stand as a licensed attorney, representing a man whose presence here is not a choice, but a necessity. Mr. Cecil Monroe is not asking for special treatment. He is asking for accountability." She allowed the sentence to hang, then took 2 steps toward the jury box, maintaining eye contact, but never pushing her presence too far forward. Her tone was factual, measured, devoid of embellishment. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture broadly. Her power came from how little she needed to perform. AOC clicked the remote in her hand, and the projection screen behind her lit up. A simple document filled the space. Monroe's release order. Date, January 11th. Bold, underlined, signed. "This is the official notice that Mr. Monroe's detention was lifted," she said, turning slightly to address the jury. "This order was issued before any of the injuries documented in his medical reports were recorded." She clicked again. A second slide appeared, the nurse's examination form, dated January 13th. That's 2 days later. 2 days between when he should have been released and when he finally was. She turned back. "Now I want to be clear. We are not asking this court to assume malice. We are asking it to recognize failure. Failure of timing, failure of oversight, and failure of protocol." Sturgis shifted loudly in his chair, arms folding in mock frustration. "Objection," he said with a sigh. "She's speculating. This is already argumentative." AOC didn't turn toward him. She simply glanced at the judge, still centered in her stance. Driscoll raised one brow, then looked down at his notes. "She's still in opening remarks," he said dryly. "Overruled." There was a faint rustle from the gallery, a moment of unexpected pleasure, as if the audience had just watched someone land a precise, quiet blow. AOC moved to the next slide. Overlapping security logs, the inconsistencies between handwritten entries and keycard access times. She didn't accuse. She observed. She let the documents speak, and all she did was connect the threads between them. A web of errors that, when viewed together, no longer looked accidental. She didn't use the word cover-up. She didn't need to. What she emphasized instead was pattern, how procedures existed not just to guide action, but to protect people. "When those procedures break," she said, "they don't just fail the system. They fail the person trapped inside it." Her closing note was brief, no dramatic pause, no soaring statement. Mr. Monroe entered a facility due to a clerical error. But what happened to him after that error was not clerical. It was physical, and it was preventable. She returned to her seat without even glancing at the defense. And as she sat down, a quiet realization passed over the room. The trial had just begun again, but on her terms. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood again, there was no change in her tone, no sudden rise in volume, no shift toward spectacle. She didn't pace. She didn't perform. What she brought instead was something far more dangerous in a courtroom like this. Calm, undeniable logic. Layered, deliberate, and quietly devastating. "Let's look at the surveillance logs," she said, stepping toward the screen again. A new slide appeared. Grainy black and white images from the correctional facility's internal monitoring system. One frame showed the hallway outside Monroe's cell, time-stamped at 5:12 a.m. on January 12th. AOC circled it on the screen with a laser pointer, her hand steady. "This image shows 3 officers entering the East Wing holding block," she said, clicking to the next slide. Now, according to the official schedule, this shift wasn't set to begin until 6 a.m. One of those officers, based on badge logs, hadn't even officially signed in. She turned to the jury. "Now ask yourself, why would staff be entering a wing early, unscheduled, without formal login? And more importantly, why does the official report say nothing of this activity? A few jurors shifted in their seats, not dramatically but noticeably. One man, seated near the center, leaned forward just slightly, eyes narrowed on the screen. Another juror folded her arms, her lips pressed tightly together as if holding a question she hadn't expected to have. AOC clicked again. Next, the facility's own training protocol, Section 14B, Use of Force Standards. She held up a laminated page from the Ashland Correctional Training Manual. It appeared beside the surveillance images in split screen. AOC read aloud, voice even, her finger gliding over each line. Physical force shall only be used when an inmate presents a clear and present danger to self, staff, or others. In all other circumstances, verbal de-escalation must be attempted before any physical action is taken. She paused, not for effect, but to let the words land. My client, she continued, gesturing to Monroe, is 67 years old. He suffers from degenerative joint disease. He has a history of spinal arthritis, which is documented in his intake form. He walks with a limp and uses assistance for stairs. No weapon was found in his possession. No signs of aggression were logged. And yet, he left with fractured ribs, a bruised face, and a damaged radial nerve. No outrage, no crescendo, just fact after fact, stacked with such precision that the room had no place to hide from them. The slide changed again. Monroe's medical chart. AOC pointed to the diagram of injuries. This is consistent with blunt force trauma. Multiple points of impact. Most notably, a contusion on the back of his head. The incident report claimed no head contact occurred. She let that contradiction sit. You can redact names, she said, voice now a little lower. But you can't redact contradictions, and you can't redact patterns. On the bench, Judge Driscoll leaned forward ever so slightly, his elbows pressed against the armrests. He no longer looked bored. He looked invested, maybe curious, maybe unsettled, but certainly no longer dismissive. Sturgis scribbled furiously at his table, flipping through his notes in increasingly agitated motions. He didn't speak, but his posture had tightened. The quiet certainty with which he had once claimed the room was gone. AOC looked at the jury once more. We're not here to guess what happened. We're here to ask why the systems built to protect people instead left one man bruised and silenced, and why no one thought we'd look close enough to notice. She stepped back, clicked off the projector, and returned to her seat. No fist on the table, no raised voice, just quiet firepower, the kind that didn't need applause because the truth had already spoken louder than anything she could say. The courtroom had settled into a strange stillness, one that didn't quite feel like silence, but more like something holding its breath. After the surveillance footage, the training manual, the broken timeline laid bare, it was clear that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had done something that rarely happened this early in a trial. She'd made people uncomfortable without raising her voice once, and yet she didn't continue, not immediately. She remained seated for a moment longer than expected, flipping once more through a page in Lauren's annotated file, underlining a phrase in pencil, almost as if stalling, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of what came next. When she stood again, she didn't reach for the projector remote, didn't move toward the evidence table. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, standing just behind the plaintiff's table, hands resting lightly on the closed file. Your Honor, she said calmly, before I proceed with additional evidence, I'd like the court's permission to briefly address a matter that occurred earlier this morning. Not as part of my argument, but as context, for this room, and for the record. Driscoll looked up slowly, his mouth tightening. He tapped his pen once, then gave a slight nod. Briefly. AOC inclined her head in acknowledgement. Then, without ceremony, without affectation, she reached up with her right hand and touched the small silver pin, still fastened to her lapel. I was fined this morning, she began, for wearing this. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but her fingers lingered on the pin. It caught a shard of light from the window panes high above the jury box, glinting just enough to draw every eye in the room. This was my grandmother, she continued. She wore it the day she was denied a home loan in the Bronx, not because of bad credit, but because she had an accent, and a last name that made someone behind a desk uncomfortable. That pin, in that moment, stayed with her for the rest of her life, and it stayed with me too. She let her hand fall back to her side. I didn't wear it to make a statement. I wore it because I never take it off. She paused, letting that settle, not in a dramatic way, but in the same way someone lets the truth breathe before it's dismissed. I understand courtroom decorum, she said. I understand protocol, but I also understand perception. And I understand what it means when a symbol of someone's heritage, someone's family, is labeled a threat simply because it isn't neutral enough. A low shifting sound moved through the jury box. One of the jurors, a middle-aged black woman with a navy blouse, tilted her head ever so slightly. Another juror, a younger man who had barely blinked all morning, suddenly looked up and locked eyes with AOC. It's not political, AOC said again, her voice firmer now. It's personal, but more than that, it's historical. Because moments like this one don't happen in a vacuum. They are part of a long and unbroken pattern of what we choose to label as disruptive and who we assume is making the disruption. Sturgis made a faint scoffing sound from his table. Driscoll didn't acknowledge it. I did not come here today to challenge this court, she concluded, but I will not ignore what this court chose to challenge in me. She didn't wait for a reaction. She didn't raise her chin. She simply turned toward the evidence screen and clicked to the next slide. But the pause lingered. It echoed. And in its quiet wake, something inside the room, inside the people listening, shifted for good. The slide on the screen was plain. A black header reading Hope versus Pelzer 2002, with a single excerpt below in bold text. The court's words were unembellished but sharp. The unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, even when not resulting in serious injury. AOC let it sit there for a moment, not because the jury needed time to read it, they already had, but because they needed time to consider what it meant when pain was separated from injury, when harm was measured not in bruises, but in the intention behind them. This is precedent, she said, her tone still even but unmistakably firm. In Hope versus Pelzer, the Supreme Court ruled that when an inmate was handcuffed to a hitching post in the sun for hours, without food, without water, it violated the Eighth Amendment. And it violated it not because bones were broken, but because dignity was. She clicked again. A new slide appeared. Hudson vs. McMillian, 1992. In Hudson, the court faced a different situation. The injuries were minor. No broken ribs, no permanent disability. But the beating itself, delivered by prison guards while the inmate was restrained, was found unconstitutional. Because what mattered wasn't just the damage, what mattered was the intent behind it. AOC looked up from the screen and turned back toward the jury. In both cases, the ruling was clear. You do not have to leave a man unable to walk to have violated his rights. You only have to treat him like he isn't human. She moved slowly across the front of the courtroom now, pausing beside the plaintiff's table. Mr. Monroe's injuries are not minor. They are documented, visible, permanent. But even if they weren't, the facts would still matter. The timing of his supposed release, the unauthorized entry into his cell, the silence in the incident report, the contradictions in the logs. Her eyes landed on one juror, then another. She didn't plead. She didn't push. She asked them to think. We know from the record that he was detained past his scheduled release. We know he suffered injuries that were never properly documented at the time. And we know that the facility's own protocol was either ignored or rewritten after the fact. Sturgis stood, letting out an audible exhale. Objection, Your Honor. She's editorializing. These cases don't apply directly. This is a courtroom, not a constitutional theory seminar. The judge didn't even let AOC respond. Overruled, Driscoll said sharply, turning his head fully toward Sturgis. Sit down. It was the first time his voice had cracked with real irritation, and it sent a small shiver through the gallery. Sturgis hesitated, clearly caught off guard, then returned to his seat, his lips pressed thin. AOC turned back to the jury without a word. She didn't acknowledge the moment. She didn't need to. Instead, she advanced the slide one more time. On the screen now was Monroe's medical chart. Next to it, a single quote from Hudson. The absence of serious injury does not end the Eighth Amendment inquiry. She let it hang there for a second. Then, it's not just about what was done, it's about why it was allowed to happen, and whether this court will choose to call it by its name or pretend that harm only counts when it's written in blood. She returned to the table and sat down slowly, organizing her papers in silence. And this time, even the judge didn't look away. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finished drawing the final line between precedent and present-day injustice, something intangible but deeply real shifted in the courtroom. The evidence was still on the screen, the lights still humming faintly above, and Judge Driscoll still sat at the bench. But the jury was no longer passive. They were leaning in, brows furrowed not in confusion, but in concern, in conviction. They weren't just absorbing, they were aligning. A young man in the back row of the jury box, who had spent the better part of the morning avoiding eye contact, now followed AOC's every step as she moved quietly back to the center of the room. An older woman seated next to him adjusted her posture with a resolve that hadn't been there hours earlier. Even the bailiff, whose job was to remain still and stone-faced, had stopped shifting between glances at the clock and was now watching AOC with fixed attention. The room wasn't with her out of spectacle. It was with her because of something deeper. Something in the steadiness of her tone, the patience of her logic, and the way she built her case like a quiet architect, not a performer. She didn't need volume, she had velocity, and it was picking up. She paused at the center of the courtroom again, not grandstanding, just still, and looked briefly toward the plaintiff's table. Cecil Monroe sat as he had for most of the trial, quiet and composed, but now there was something different in the set of his shoulders. He looked like a man slowly unclenching from years of bracing himself. AOC's eyes met his, and he gave a barely perceptible nod. Not of thanks yet, but of recognition. AOC turned back to the jury. She didn't raise her voice for her final thought. She didn't need to. In the end, she said slowly, this case is about more than what happened inside a prison cell. It's about what we choose to ignore and what we call disruptive, not because it is, but because it dares to remind us of something we'd rather forget. Then she reached up and touched the small silver pin on her blazer. It shimmered again under the light. Not flashy, not loud, just there. This, she said, her fingers resting lightly on it, was called a violation of courtroom neutrality, a threat to objectivity, a disruption. But my grandmother wore it on the day she was denied dignity, and I wear it today for the same reason she did then. Not to provoke, but to remember. She dropped her hand and held still for a beat, just long enough for the room to lean forward in anticipation of whatever came next, and then she gave it to them. Simple, calm, final. If you're afraid of a symbol, maybe the threat isn't the metal, but the message behind it. The words dropped like a stone into still water, not loud, not explosive, but irreversible. Several jurors blinked, not from confusion, but from impact. Someone in the gallery gasped softly, instinctively, like they hadn't meant to make a sound at all. The room didn't erupt, it tightened, compressed itself around that line, folded into silence not because it didn't understand, but because it suddenly understood too much. At the bench, Judge Driscoll sat back, just slightly. His hands, once neatly folded, opened on the desk. His gaze, which had earlier roamed in dismissal, now held. Not approval, not outrage, but something he hadn't shown all day. Uncertainty. And though AOC said nothing more, returning to the table with the quiet of someone who knew her work was done, that line, that single sentence, was already writing itself into the walls. By nightfall, a reporter seated near the gallery exit would upload it in a 12-second clip. It would be subtitled, reshared, dissected. But in this moment, it didn't belong to the internet yet. It belonged to the room, and the room would never forget it. The room had not yet exhaled. The silence after AOC's final sentence in the previous session still lingered like mist, thin but inescapable. Even after the judge called a recess and court officers opened the doors, the gallery had moved quietly, as though afraid to disrupt something sacred. But now, as court reconvened and the bailiff called order, the atmosphere had changed, not reversed but strained. The defense was cornered, and everyone knew it. Daniel Sturgis walked slowly to the center of the room with a composure he clearly hoped would pass for control. His tie had been readjusted, his hair smoothed, but the glint in his eye from earlier, the self-assurance, the off-handed arrogance, wasn't there. It had been replaced by something more restrained, strategic, defensive. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice softer than before, "we've heard some powerful language today, evocative, personal, even historical, and I respect that. But I'd like to bring us back to something less abstract, something we can see." He turned toward the screen, nodded to the tech operator, and a grainy black and white video began to play. "This is Mr. Monroe," he said, gesturing, "leaving Ashland Correctional Facility on January 13th. Captured by the hallway security camera at 9:04 a.m. The screen showed Monroe, visibly older, wearing the same oversized coat he still owned, walking down a narrow corridor flanked by two officers. He wasn't smiling, but he was upright. No limp was obvious, no dramatic signs of injury. "He's not being carried," Sturgis said. "He's not slouched, he's not bleeding, he's not in a wheelchair. He's walking, calmly, without any visible sign of distress." He clicked to pause the footage at the moment Monroe turned the corner out of view. "Now," he said, facing the jury again, "we've heard testimony about broken ribs, nerve damage, and facial bruising. We've seen diagrams and forms. But what we haven't seen until now is Mr. Monroe in real time. And this is the moment he left the facility." He paced slowly in front of the jury box, letting the implication hang. "If the alleged assault occurred on January 12th, as claimed, and if it resulted in the kind of injuries we've been told, how is he walking unaided 24 hours later?" He let the question sit. "Is it possible," he continued, "that the pain was real, but the cause was misremembered? Or perhaps that the injuries were aggravated elsewhere? Or even that they were not as severe as portrayed?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Sturgis noticed. "The Constitution protects all people," he added, "but it also demands that we make decisions based on facts, not just emotion, not just memory. This footage, it's not speculation, it's not interpretation, it's what actually happened." At the plaintiff's table, AOC didn't move. She watched the footage with the same calm scrutiny she had applied to every exhibit, every witness, every shift in the room. But she also knew what was happening. Sturgis wasn't trying to dismantle her argument. He was trying to dilute it, to cloud it with ambiguity, to give the jury just enough doubt to feel safe saying, "maybe." He returned to the defense table, clicked his pen once, and said nothing more. The courtroom was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not reverent, not shaken, just confused. It was the silence that comes after clarity is deliberately smeared with static. And for the first time since stepping into the case, AOC knew the next move wouldn't just require logic, it would require something sharper. Precision, dissection, truth, with a scalpel, not a sword. The screen still showed the paused image, Cecil Monroe mid-step, shoulders squared, turning the corner in the correctional facility's hallway. Sturgis had timed it well. The moment looked almost serene, almost whole, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't look unsettled. She leaned forward, clicked her pen once, then rose with the same measured calm that had carried her through every moment of this trial. She didn't ask the jury to forget what they had seen. She simply asked them to look again. "Permission to revisit the footage for clarification," she said to Judge Driscoll. He gave a nod. "Proceed." She walked slowly to the projector, standing slightly to the side so the jury had a clear view. "I'd like to direct your attention," she said, "to the bottom right of the screen. The timestamp reads 9:04:33. She clicked to advance the frame 1 second. "And here, 9:04:34. Then she clicked again. The screen shifted from the surveillance image to a scan of the facility's medical intake log. The camera panned in digitally until a single entry was visible, highlighted faintly. "Now this document," she said, "is from the intake nurse's desk at the Dallas County General Hospital. The timestamp is handwritten and verified by staff login." She paused. "It reads, January 14th, 11:36 a.m. She let the numbers land. That's 14 hours and 32 minutes after Mr. Monroe was released from the Ashland Correctional Facility. And that, she said, turning toward the jury, is when he first received medical treatment for what were later diagnosed as fractured ribs, a bruised radial nerve, and early signs of internal bleeding. She moved to the center of the room now, turning gently toward the defense table. So to summarize the logic we've been offered, because Mr. Monroe appeared upright in a surveillance hallway, before any official medical evaluation was made, his injuries must not be real. She turned her eyes back to the jury, never raising her voice. We're being asked to believe that pain must always look obvious, that someone who's hurt can't walk, that if a man isn't bleeding out in a hallway, his bones must be fine, his nerves must be working, his trauma must be fake. She clicked again. The screen changed to a still from the medical record, highlighting the technician's note. Subject arrived displaying visible discomfort, cradling left side, elevated blood pressure, reported dizziness, and tenderness to touch and rib area. Written by a licensed technician, AOC continued, not a political operative, not a lawyer, a nurse, whose only job was to assess a human being in front of her and write down what she saw. She turned to Sturgis. May I ask a few questions? He gave a non-committal nod, but it was tight. She stepped closer. Mr. Sturgis, can you confirm the timestamp on the surveillance footage is January 13th, 09:04 a.m.? Yes. And can you confirm that Mr. Monroe was released directly after this footage was taken? Yes. And can you confirm that the defense did not present any medical report between that footage and the hospital visit? No such report exists. AOC smiled softly. Exactly. She walked back toward the jury. Pain doesn't wait for a camera. Trauma doesn't always arrive with swelling, and injustice doesn't always scream. It often walks quietly down a hallway, just trying to survive long enough to be believed. She let the screen fade to black. No dramatic flourish, just stillness. One juror exhaled, sharp and silent, like a balloon letting out air slowly. In Sturgis, he looked down for the first time all morning. His legal pad, once filled with bullet points, now seemed like a shield that had crumbled before it was ever tested. The moment the defense called the credibility of the witness into question, you could feel the energy in the room constrict. It wasn't the first time a trial had turned on reputation instead of facts, but this one carried a sharper edge. The witness, Jaron Delaney, had taken the stand with a firm voice and eyes that never wavered, even as he described the sounds he heard from Monroe's cell that night. Metal scraping, a thud, a choked groan, then silence. He hadn't seen it happen. He had only heard it. But what he heard, he said, never sounded like discipline. It sounded like a warning wrapped in pain. And then, just as the courtroom began to lean in, Sturgis struck. You've been convicted of perjury before, haven't you? He asked, pacing in front of the witness stand like a man sharpening a blade. Delaney nodded once, jaw tight. I have. Sturgis turned toward the jury, letting the answer hang. So we're to believe you now? After you lied under oath before? After you jeopardized the integrity of another courtroom and another truth? Delaney didn't flinch. I lied once. Then I lost my son's trust. I don't lie anymore. It was a strong answer. But Sturgis wasn't aiming for truth. He was aiming for doubt, just enough to stain the testimony. He didn't need to destroy the story, only weaken it. When he returned to his seat, there was a faint hum of discomfort in the room. Jurors shifted, unsure whether to compartmentalize or disqualify. That's when AOC stood again, deliberately, quietly, her notes untouched. She didn't rush to Delaney's defense. She didn't try to wash away his past. Instead, she walked slowly to the center of the room and looked directly at the jury. Let's not pretend we didn't see that coming, she began. Mr. Delaney sat in that chair knowing exactly what would happen. He knew the second he raised his right hand, someone would try to take him down, not with facts, but with his own history. And yet, he testified anyway. She paused just long enough for the weight of that choice to settle. Now ask yourself, she continued, voice steady, why would a man who knows his reputation is flawed, who knows he will be ridiculed, discredited, and dismissed, why would he still get up here and speak under oath, knowing you'd be told not to trust a single word? She turned now to face the jurors more directly. Because for some people, truth is worth more than self-protection. Because some people still believe that dignity isn't a reward, it's a responsibility. Mr. Delaney didn't need to come forward. He could have stayed silent, but he didn't, and that tells you more than his record ever could. There was no fire in her tone, only clarity, the kind that didn't demand agreement, it invited it. She walked toward the bench, lifting a document from her folder, a copy of Delaney's previous case file. Yes, he lied in 2011. He lied to protect someone else from prosecution. He admitted it. He served time, and he lost a lot. But today he had no one to protect. No deal on the table. No gain in the balance. He only had the choice between silence and integrity. She looked over at the jury one final time. You were never asked to trust him because he's perfect. You're being asked to trust him because this time he had every reason not to speak. And he still did. Judge Driscoll said nothing. Neither did Sturgis. But the jury was no longer looking at a criminal record. They were looking at a man who stood up, knowing he'd be knocked down, and did it anyway. And in AOC's silence that followed, that truth echoed louder than anything on paper. By the time the courtroom reconvened for what everyone suspected might be the final evidentiary push, the tension had congealed into something dense, almost physical. It wasn't just anticipation anymore. It was reverence laced with dread. AOC had systematically taken the defense's every assumption about optics, about credibility, about silence, and turned them inside out. But no one expected she still had one more move left. She walked to the front of the courtroom with a folder in hand, unlabeled, plain, and slightly worn at the corners. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voice, no pregnant silence, just a simple sentence that landed like a gavel. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit one final exhibit into evidence. Judge Driscoll, whose tone had gradually softened over the course of the trial, gave a nod, slow and deliberate. Proceed. AOC held up the document. This, she said, is an internal incident report from Ashland Correctional Facility. It was obtained through a FOIA request filed during pretrial, and while the names have been redacted, the metadata and timestamps are intact. She handed a copy to the clerk, who brought it to the bench and the jury simultaneously. When the pages were distributed, the courtroom leaned in. There were heavy black bars across most of the lines, thick enough to obscure names, departments, even entire paragraphs. But what remained was damning in its repetition. Mentions of corrective physical response, use of force justifiable due to inmate resistance, and, chillingly, 3 separate notations of similar protocol deployed as per January 12th. 3 entries, all dated within 6 months of Monroe's incident, all describing variations of the same incident type, all ending in redacted names and generic outcomes. This document, AOC said, her voice calm, doesn't tell us who. It doesn't need to. It tells us something more important. She turned to the jury. It tells us that Mr. Monroe's experience wasn't isolated. It was replicated, rehearsed, repeated, and that's not an accident. It's a pattern. She stepped closer to the jury box, flipping a page. You can black out names, you can black out titles, but you can't black out behavior. And when behavior repeats with this level of frequency and similarity, it stops being individual misconduct and starts becoming institutional culture. She let the statement sit, not because she needed it to echo, because it deserved to echo. Sturgis rose halfway from his seat. Objection. This is speculative. Redacted documents can't prove causality. Judge Driscoll didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took the report in both hands and studied it, line by line. His brow furrowed, not in annoyance this time, but in something closer to disbelief. And when he finally looked up at AOC, it was the first time he didn't look through her, but at her, not as a disruptor, not even as a surprise, but as a peer. The objection is overruled, he said, not curt, not performative, measured, grounded. AOC gave a small nod and turned back to the jury. Mr. Monroe didn't just walk into a bad moment. He walked into a system that's built to deny, deflect, and delete, and we now have the pattern to prove it. She returned to her seat slowly, the final document still on the screen behind her. No flourish, no crescendo. But in the gallery, no one moved. And in the jury box, something invisible had just locked into place. And Judge Driscoll, once irritated, once skeptical, stared at her for a beat longer than protocol required. Because in that moment, he didn't see a congresswoman playing lawyer. He saw a lawyer who had just dismantled a wall others had called permanent. The courtroom emptied slowly after AOC's final exhibit. It wasn't the usual shuffle of heels and murmurs, more like a reluctant drift, as though the gravity of what had just happened kept people from fully lifting their feet off the floor. Even the jury's departure to the deliberation chamber had carried a certain sacred weight, every step like a clock hand moving forward without rush, but with consequence. Outside the courthouse, reporters began clustering beneath the overhang, microphones ready. But inside, no one dared speak above a whisper. Judge Driscoll had recessed the court without expression, but his eyes betrayed the shift. Something about the pin, the pattern, the quiet logic, it had all landed. An hour passed, then another. Cecil Monroe sat quietly beside AOC, his hands gripping each other like they were the only thing tethering him to the room. Every few minutes he looked over at her, not seeking comfort, just trying to process the absurdity of who was sitting next to him. This woman had no reason to be here, no legal obligation, no re-election motivation. Just that small, steel certainty in her eyes, the same one that unnerved Sturgis and slowly converted a courtroom that hadn't come to be moved. A quiet knock broke the tension. The jury had returned. Everyone stood. The bailiff took the envelope. Driscoll entered with a heavier presence this time, less protocol, more gravity. He looked down at the verdict slip. In the matter of Monroe versus Ashland Correctional Facility, he read, on the claim of use of excessive force resulting in physical and psychological injury, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. A stillness bloomed across the room, and then, we further award damages in the amount of $285,000. The number didn't echo. It didn't need to. Cecil Monroe didn't cry. His shoulders didn't shake. But something invisible inside him gave way. His spine loosened. His chest sank slightly, not from defeat, but from release, as if his body had been bracing for injustice so long that it forgot how to relax without it. He looked at AOC, eyes wide with something more complicated than gratitude, something closer to disbelief wrapped in quiet reverence. You didn't have to, he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. You really didn't. AOC turned toward him slowly. Her voice was even, soft, but her words carried weight. But someone did. No spotlight found them in that moment. No camera flash interrupted. But the room felt as though the temperature had shifted, just slightly toward something warmer. Something cleaner. Across the aisle, Sturgis stared blankly at his table, tapping his pen once, then again, but not writing a thing. He had lost the narrative. Worse, he'd lost control of it. And the courtroom, once his stage, no longer responded to his cues. Judge Driscoll nodded once to the jury. Your service in this case is complete. You are dismissed with the thanks of the court. The jurors stood, some quicker than others, some still carrying expressions they couldn't quite explain. A few glanced toward AOC with something unspoken in their eyes. Not admiration, not awe, just belief. The kind that says, I saw what you did, and I'm not going to forget it. Outside, as murmurs grew into headlines, Monroe sat still for another minute. He had his justice. But it wasn't just about money or paperwork or headlines. It was about being seen and having someone stand up beside him, not because it made sense, but because it was right. And AOC? She didn't smile. She just gathered her things with the same calm she'd arrived with, carrying no entourage, no camera crew. Only her grandmother's pin and the weight of a fight that no one asked her to fight. But she chose anyway. The courtroom had nearly cleared. The hum of movement faded into the polished floors and wooden echoes. Cecil Monroe was gone, escorted out with quiet dignity and a hand resting over his heart. The jury had exited with cautious reverence, as though unsure whether they'd just witnessed a verdict or something closer to a reckoning. AOC gathered her notes with practiced calm, but just before reaching the door, the clerk approached her quietly. Judge Driscoll would like a word. In chambers. She hesitated only a moment, then nodded. Inside, the judge's quarters were dimly lit, lined with rows of legal volumes and one crooked photo of Driscoll in younger years, clutching a law diploma, wearing a smile so unfamiliar it seemed borrowed. He didn't stand when she entered, just motioned to the chair across from his desk. She sat, spine straight, expression neutral. Driscoll folded his hands. There was no gavel between them now, just silence and something more human. It was never about the pin, he said finally, voice low. That morning, it was about control, about reminding everyone who held the rules, who enforced the room. He looked directly at her now, not over glasses, not through title, just her. But you reminded me of what real power looks like. AOC didn't respond right away. She glanced briefly at the small lapel on her coat, the silver outline of Puerto Rico still pinned above her heart. I didn't come to prove anything, she said simply. Driscoll gave a slow, almost imperceptible smile. That's why you did. There was no follow-up, no handshake or pageantry, just a quiet understanding shared between two people who entered a courtroom from opposite ends, and somehow still managed to meet in the middle. The courthouse steps were no longer just marble. They had become a stage. The moment AOC stepped through the wide double doors, the hum of the waiting crowd exploded into a cacophony of shutters, microphones, and breathless urgency. Reporters surged forward like water seeking its level, each armed with a question that they hoped might twist a moment into a headline. Congresswoman, was this political theater? Do you see this as a victory against the justice system or within it? Would you say you won the case or just the moment? The questions came in flurries, layered on top of one another, building a storm where clarity wasn't the goal. Reaction was. AOC paused at the top of the stairs. Her coat was buttoned. Her bag rested lightly over one shoulder, and on her lapel, the same modest silver pin caught the light of the late afternoon sun, glinting, not loudly but persistently. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean into the frenzy. Instead, she let the silence swell for half a beat. Then she answered, not to deflect, but to center. I didn't come here for headlines, she said, her voice strong enough to cut through the noise without needing to overpower it. I came because someone needed help. Because when a system forgets a name, when a man is told his pain is procedural, that's where justice is supposed to step in. And sometimes, justice needs a witness who won't look away. The crowd stilled, not silenced but recalibrated. The lenses kept flashing, but fewer questions followed. Her words weren't just a statement, they were a redefinition. And in that instant, it was clear. AOC hadn't just won a case. She had reclaimed what justice could still mean, if someone dared to show up for it. By morning, the world had already clipped her words down to 57 seconds. The angle was a little off-center, filmed from a gallery seat behind the rail. The audio wasn't perfect. You could hear the faint rustle of papers, the soft whir of courtroom HVAC, but AOC's voice cut through it like a scalpel. If you're afraid of a symbol, maybe it's not the symbol that's threatening. Maybe it's the truth that comes with it. No music, no filter, no added graphics, just conviction, and yet it traveled faster than any headline. Within hours, the clip lit up timelines and inboxes. Teachers paused their civics lessons to stream it on projectors. A retired Marine reposted it with the caption, "She spoke for me when no one else would." A law student annotated it in the margin of her con law textbook. On a subway platform in the Bronx, a teenage girl nudged her mother gently and whispered, "She looks like us." Cable pundits scrambled to spin it. Some framed it as a challenge, others as a moment of clarity, but none could ignore the reach. Because this wasn't just about the verdict, it was about visibility. The kind that doesn't ask permission, doesn't wait for approval, the kind that stands tall in rooms designed to minimize. At a middle school in Tulsa, a social studies teacher paused the clip, looked at her class and asked, "Why do you think that mattered?" A boy in the back raised his hand. Because she wasn't yelling. She was just being brave. Exactly, not loud, not flashy, just brave. And that was enough to make the whole country look again and maybe see differently. A week later, under the vaulted lights of Capitol Hill, AOC sat quietly during a House committee session on criminal justice reform. Her posture, calm but firm, her expression measured. The hearing hadn't started yet, but eyes had already found her. Not because she spoke, but because she wore the pin again. Same silver outline, same placement, just above the heart. As staffers bustled around her, adjusting microphones and checking time slots, a journalist leaning against the chamber wall caught her eye. "Congresswoman," he called gently, gesturing toward the lapel. "Is that pin a symbol of defiance now?" She looked down at it briefly, then back up with the faintest smile. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "It's not defiance, it's memory." She paused just long enough for the room to listen. "My grandmother wore it when they told her she didn't belong, when they closed bank doors, when they skipped her in lines, when silence was expected." She touched the pin lightly, not for show, but for her. "Now I wear it, because I do." The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. Some moments aren't about noise. They're about knowing. And in that silence, something enduring took root. She didn't just carry her grandmother's memory. She extended it. This story isn't just about a courtroom victory. It's about the quiet power of presence. AOC didn't enter to make headlines. She showed up because someone needed her to. In a world where status often shouts, she reminded us that dignity whispers, that a symbol worn close to the heart can carry generations of memory, pain, and progress. Her strength wasn't in defiance, but in grounded purpose, in choosing to act when silence would have been easier. It reminds us that real leadership often looks like listening, like showing up, like staying steady in the storm. What about you? Have you ever worn something, not for fashion, but for meaning? Something small that carried a big part of your story? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.